Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the difficulties that faced President Adams throughout his presidency. We'll talk about the XYZ affair and how it created a call to arms and a quasi-war with France. Thankfully, a full war was avoided. We'll also talk about all of the opposition to Adams, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, which even led to the Kentucky Resolution, where nullification was introduced. And finally, we'll talk about the disputed election of 1800, which really was a revolution in and of itself. But before we go any further, let's review from our last lesson. We began by talking about how much Washington influenced the country as its first president. We also talked about the 3 warnings that Washington gave in his farewell address. Washington warned against political parties, foreign alliances that would drag the United States into war, and public or national debt. Sadly, the United States didn't heed his warnings and immediately suffered the consequences of political parties. It took over a century to form foreign alliances that dragged us into foreign wars, and our national debt today is ridiculous. Now, George Washington was greatly loved by the American people. Henry Lee, a fellow Virginian, said he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. During the election of 1796, the Democratic Republicans ran Thomas Jefferson with Aaron Burr, and the Federalists chose John Adams with Thomas Pinckney as his vice president. The Federalists were split, which caused some of them not to vote for Pinckney. The consequence? Jefferson won the vice presidency, which created a situation that made it hard to have a unified administration. The fact that John Adams had been Washington's vice president allowed him to observe the problems of the new government firsthand. There have been few presidents that have come to office as qualified as John Adams, but he lived in Washington's shadow. On the day Adams took office, the cheers for Washington were louder than those for Adams. People would miss the great man who was leaving office, but they had little praise for the man who succeeded him. Adams made a huge mistake when he kept the same cabinet members from Washington's administration. Hamilton really controlled them, and they didn't cooperate with Adams or his policies. That also allowed Adams' political enemies to criticize him to the American people. Okay, so let's get started. Poor Adams. Not many really understood him or liked him. Not only did he have to deal with internal problems, but also foreign policy problems as well. One of the biggest problems was the XYZ affair. So the French weren't really happy with the Americans because they'd negotiated the Jay Treaty with the British. Strangely enough, even though the Americans hated the treaty, the French were mad because they felt that the Americans had betrayed them with the British. The Americans didn't even get anything worthwhile, but it didn't matter. They hadn't declared war on Britain, therefore the Americans were bad. The French ordered their navy to raid American shipping, and Britain was still impressing American sailors. So when the French would capture a British ship and there were Americans on it, the French would threaten to hang the Americans because it appeared that the Americans were helping the British. The U.S. couldn't win. If they favored the French, the British would attack their ships and impress their sailors. If they favored the British, the French would attack their ships and imprison the poor sailors that had been part of the impressment. And then, to add insult to injury, the French refused to receive Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, not to be confused with Thomas Pinckney, his brother. Now, of course, like when the Democratic Republicans wanted to go to war with Britain, the Federalists wanted to go to war with France. But Adams refused, choosing diplomacy instead. He sent John Marshall and Elbridge Gerry to help Pinckney. Now, he thought that the three of them would make more of an impression on the French than just one envoy. But the three of them sat around waiting for 9 months to even get a meeting with Talleyrand, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. They did meet with 3 agents, though. The agents implied that the Americans could have an audience with Talleyrand if they would give a $250,000 bribe and ensure a $10 million loan to France. Yeah, that didn't go over very well with Adams or Congress when they found out about it. Adams went to Congress and explained how the U.S. had been insulted by France with bribery and, well, extortion. The Democratic Republicans demanded to see all of the French correspondence. Now, Adams laid out every piece of evidence before an open session of Congress, but replaced the 3 French agents with X, Y, and Z. It's commonly assumed that Adams replaced the names of X, Y, and Z to protect the agents. But protect them from whom? They were in France, and it wasn't like the U.S. was going to send a hitman to France to kill them. But then, when France did find out, wow, someone was in the doghouse. Talleyrand, who knew exactly who the agents were, told the French government that he didn't know anything about the agents. The American press, who wasn't really the same press that we know today, instantly dubbed it the XYZ affair, a very sensationalist name, very sinister and mysterious. Congress's response was to arm the country for action. Adams called for a stronger Navy, and Congress voted, in spite of Democratic-Republican opposition, to make the Navy a separate department and build 40 ships. The USS Constitution was commissioned as one of the 40 ships. Now, Congress also ordered the Army to be increased by 3 times its size. Even with all the military buildup, Congress never actually declared war. Because some fighting did occur, the military conflict between the U.S. and France was called a quasi-war. Believe me, the American public wanted war. They were totally offended by the actions of the French. But Adams hesitated. He didn't think that the U.S. was really prepared to fight, and a full-scale war was just unwise. But while Adams was hesitating, France formed another government under Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon realized that the U.S. might be a stronger enemy than most of the French thought possible. Adams wanted Napoleon to pay the damages for the destruction of American ships, but Adams had to settle for the Convention of 1800, which basically ended the formal alliance between France and the U.S. Adams avoided war, but most of his countrymen were angry with him. Both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans denounced him. But he did what he thought was best for the country, keeping them out of a war that the country wasn't ready for. Not only did Adams have to deal with foreign policy problems, but he also had to deal with domestic problems as well. In 1798, the Federalists in Congress passed 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists claimed that the laws would help protect the country during the threat of war. The Federalists also planned on using the acts to keep the Democratic-Republican Party from gaining too much power. Because Adams didn't oppose the acts and actually signed them into law, a lot of people grew to hate Adams even more. The first law, the Naturalization Act, lengthened the amount of time that an immigrant had to live in the U.S. before he could get his American citizenship. Now, since most of the new immigrants joined the Democratic-Republican Party because they viewed it as the party of the common man, the Federalists thought that this law would slow down the growth of the voter base of the Democratic Republicans. That way, the Federalists would be in control for a longer amount of time. The second act, the Alien Enemies Act, gave the president the power, during times of war or invasion, to imprison or expel any dangerous foreigners. That sounds reasonable, but the act was worded in a purposefully vague way. Terms like peace, safety, and war weren't defined. So literally, it was feasible that if you were foreign and you disagreed with the government during wartime, you could be kicked out of the country just for disagreeing. That is scary because that smacks of a lack of freedom of speech. The third act, the Alien Act, allowed the president to deport any aliens that were thought to be dangerous, even if war had not been declared. Again, the terminology was very vague, making the interpretation of the law basically anything the enforced wanted it to mean. The last act, the Sedition Act, was the really scary one. All the others dealt with foreigners. The Sedition Act dealt with all Americans. The act said that any person who said, wrote, or published anything false or malicious against the government or its officials could be fined $2,000 and imprisoned for up to 2 years. This act was a direct violation of freedom of speech and the press, which were guaranteed by the First Amendment. Even though people were arrested under this law, only 25 of them were brought to trial and just 10 of them were convicted. The Republicans and even some Federalists worked hard to overrule the Alien and Sedition Acts. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now, these resolutions claimed that the Union of the States had been built on an agreement in which the states freely gave up their rights to a central government. But they said that the states still held powers of their own. Madison and Jefferson believed that the states should be allowed to decide whether the actions of the federal government were constitutional. The Kentucky resolution used the term nullification to describe a state's action of declaring void any federal law within its boundaries. Both sides used Amendment 10 to support their arguments. The Democratic Republicans said that Amendment 10 reserved powers not given to the federal government for the states. But the Federalists said that the amendment gives the national government supremacy over the states. This issue would plague the country for the next 60 years until it was finally decided on the fields of battle during the Civil War. The election of 1800 is often considered the most controversial election in American history. It revealed not only a major flaw in the Constitution, but also the sinfulness of mankind. Remember, this is a fallen world we live in, and we often see the results of that sinfulness rearing its ugly head in times of crisis. So even though John Adams wasn't the most popular person, the Federalists chose to stay with him and give him another chance at president. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was up for vice president. The Democratic Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson with Aaron Burr as vice president. Problem: the Constitution didn't clarify that there was an election for the president and an election for the vice president. Therefore, whoever got the second most votes got the vice presidency. So, each of the delegates of the Electoral College could cast 2 votes. The Democratic Republicans thought they had everything covered to make sure that Jefferson got president and Burr got vice president. But it didn't turn out that way. They were going to have all of their delegates vote for Jefferson and then all but one vote for Burr. But all of their delegates voted for both Jefferson and Burr, which meant they tied. Now, of course, the Democratic Republicans thought that Burr would just defer to Jefferson because everyone knew, including Burr, that Jefferson was the first choice for president. But Burr saw an opportunity to be president, and he took it. He claimed that under the Constitution, he was running for president as well. Well, that didn't go over very well with the Democratic Republicans. According to the Constitution, the decision in the case of a tie was made by the House of Representatives, which was still controlled by the Federalists. Now, there were those Federalists that just hated Jefferson, and they hoped that if they could pit Jefferson and Burr against each other, then maybe there was hope for another election, and then Adams might be made president. And then there were those, amazingly enough, like Alexander Hamilton, who hated Jefferson, but hated Burr even more. He backed Jefferson, which really surprised everyone. Finally, one of the delegates changed his vote, and Jefferson won the election. Wow, did Burr hate Hamilton. But the feelings were mutual. Burr was vice president, and the 12th Amendment solved that problem so that it never happened again. The election of 1800 could really be called the Revolution of 1800. Why? Think about it. Well, a revolution can be defined as a complete change. And believe me, the government underwent a complete change in parties. The Democratic Republicans controlled both the presidency and both houses of Congress. But what's so amazing about the Revolution of 1800 is that there was no bloodshed. There was a successful transition of power from one party to another with respect and dignity. It set the precedent for the next 200 years. Okay, so let's do a quick review of what we learned today. We talked about Adams' administration and how difficult it was because of his unpopularity. We also talked about the XYZ affair and how the French tried to bribe the American representatives in order to allow an audience with Talleyrand. Of course, that didn't go over very well with the American people. When it came out that the French agents implied that the Americans could have recognition if they would give a $250,000 bribe and ensure a $10 million loan for France, the American people were furious. So was France, actually. Adams replaced the names of the agents to XYZ to protect them. Congress took measures to arm the country for action. Adams called for a stronger navy and 40 ships to be built. The most famous was the USS Constitution. The U.S. never actually went to war with France, but because some fighting did occur, the conflict is often called a quasi-war. War was averted because Napoleon took over France and realized that the U.S. was a more formidable foe than others believed. He sought to negotiate peace. Although Adams wanted Napoleon to pay the damages for France's actions against America, Adams settled for a new agreement called the Convention of 1800, which just ended the alliance with France. Many Americans didn't appreciate what Adams did, even though it helped keep America out of a very costly war, not only financially, but in the way of casualties. Now, during this time, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. They were 4 laws that the Federalists claimed would help protect the country during the threat of war. The Naturalization Act, the Alien Enemies Act, the Alien Act, and the Sedition Act definitely violated freedom of speech and press, especially the Sedition Act. The response to the act was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. It was the very first time the term nullification was used. Nullification describes a state's act of declaring void any federal law within its boundaries. These resolutions were written by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Then there was the election of 1800. Basically, the election was still under the original Constitutional Electoral College before the 12th Amendment changed it. The Federalists put John Adams and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney up for president and vice president. The Democratic Republicans put up Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, and since the Constitution didn't differentiate between president and vice president, Aaron Burr claimed that he was running for president. The election had to go to the House of Representatives, and Jefferson won. And Burr, he was very bitter towards Alexander Hamilton, who backed Jefferson. Burr became vice president. Okay, so next time we'll be looking at the judicial branch after the election of 1800 and the midnight judges. See you next time.